So in the last video, we talked about the idea that you can define philosophy by the topics that it covers. So philosophy just is the conjunction of epistemology, ethics, politics, and metaphysics, where there may be some feature that unifies these as philosophical topics. Perhaps they all, or at least the first three, focus on prescription, or they all focus on essences. This time we're going to talk about a related notion that philosophy can be defined in terms of the jobs that it does. So the question then becomes, what are those jobs? Well, one potential job is to theorize, that is to offer theories, to offer views, to offer claims in domains where science is silent, but to do so in a sort of systematic and rigorous way. So you can think of it like this. Science as such is silent on norms and essences. So it begins with observation, and observation can't tell you about norms and essences. So why do I say that? Suppose we have someone here and he says, "You stupid, worthless piece of trash, I'm going to kill you." And he's talking to this little baby who's screaming at the top of her lungs. And along comes somebody else and says, like, "Look, since I still would have been me, even if I were a little taller or shorter, I'm only accidentally, not essentially 65 inches tall." So we have these two events. One, a person saying something about what, could have been. They could have been a little taller or shorter. And another, somebody making a moral claim. Somebody behaving in a way that we would consider morally abhorrent. So let's first think about the person whose behavior we think of as morally bad. Ask yourself this. If it's morally bad for this person to talk to the baby in this way, what would the world look like? Well, it would look just like this. You'd have this person talking to the baby in this way. Well, what if it were not morally bad for the person to talk to the baby in this way? Either it's morally neutral or it's morally good. What would the world look like? Well, it would still look exactly like this. You can't see moral goodness or moral badness. You can't hear it, feel it, taste it, or touch it. The world looks the same, sounds the same, feels the same, whether an action is morally good or morally bad. In order to determine whether it's morally good or morally bad, you need to rely on something other than observation. Observation can't tell you. Observation can tell you that this person is making a mean face and that this person is saying a horrible thing to a baby. But it can't tell you that's bad. If you think it's bad, that's judgment that you're adding on to what you observe. The observation itself doesn't get you there. And the same thing holds for what's going on the right. This person says, I would have been a bit taller. I would have still been me if I were a bit taller. So I could have been a bit taller or a bit shorter, whatever. My height isn't an essential feature of me. Well, suppose this person is wrong and her height is an essential feature of her. Well, when you measure her, you're going to find that she has the exact height that she in fact has. And now suppose the opposite. Suppose that her height isn't an essential feature of her, that it's an accidental feature, that she could have been a bit taller or shorter. Well, when you measure her, you're going to find that she has the same exact height that, she has. She has her actual height, regardless of whether that's an essential or instead an accidental feature of her. So science as such, science thought of as a discipline or a way of investigating the world that begins with observation, is silent about norms and essences because observation can't tell you anything about norms and essences. It can tell you how people in fact do behave, but not how they ought to behave. How people do in fact think, but not how they ought to think. It can tell you how tall someone actually is, but not whether that's an essential or accidental feature of her, and so on and so forth. So if we want to know about these things, if we want to know about the truth values of moral claims, supposing they have truth values, if we want to know whether you could have been late for work or whether it's necessary to you that you arrived on time, then we need a different path. And one way people have thought of philosophy is it's what provides that path. It's how we should investigate the world when science isn't up to the task. So, as it says here, if we want to know how we should reason, how we should behave, how government should work, if we want to know the essence of knowledge, justice, the mind, and persons, and more broadly, we want to know what we're thinking and talking about, then we need some other way to theorize. Philosophy fills this void, approaching with rational rigor and systematic methods issues that are not yet and never will be sort of ready for the sciences. That's one way to think about the job of philosophy. Here's another way. Some philosophers have thought of philosophy as primarily there to serve the sciences. The idea here is that philosophy lays the groundwork for sciences by clarifying key concepts and terms just enough to allow scientific investigation to proceed. So part of the reason this idea is put forward is the history of thought. So as you may or may not know, every scientific discipline was once a branch of philosophy. So what we now call physics was once called natural philosophy. And it's not accidental that it was called natural philosophy. It was a part of philosophy. And the idea goes, like any 1-minute history, this is a bit of a caricature, but the idea goes, when natural philosophers, including people like Newton, were able to sort of clear up their concepts sufficiently, when they were able to get clear enough about what they meant by relevant expressions and how they thought about the physical world, then and only then was science ready to sort of take over physics. And the same goes the idea for the most recent case, which is psychology, which was part of philosophy until the early 20th century, late 19th century. In many ways, anyway, it was part of philosophy. And at that point, the idea goes, some clever people, in effect, doing philosophy, clarified the conceptual framework enough in order for psychology to split out and become a science. Now, again, this is a caricature of the history, but this is the basic idea. One way of thinking about philosophy is that it lays the groundwork for sciences by clarifying key concepts and terms enough to allow scientific investigation. And similarly, you might think, whenever there's kind of a revolution in a science, whenever you shift from, say, Newtonian physics to relativistic physics, you're in effect doing philosophy. It's rational argumentation that leads to the shift more so than observation. You may then confirm the theorizing that led you to the shift through observation, but it's sort of argumentation and theorizing that leads to the shift in the first place. And that, to some extent, is true of the shift from Newtonian physics to relativistic physics. Okay. You might also think that, as I just said, every major branch of science is an extension of philosophy. Another possible job for philosophy is this: to create what ancient Greeks called aporia, which is a sense of puzzlement. And the idea here is that you believe a lot of things, and some of them fit well together, and some of them maybe don't. And one thing that philosophy can do is sort of point out the contradictions, point out the places where your beliefs don't fit well together, thereby creating a sense of puzzlement in you. And that sense of puzzlement is the basis for progress in your thinking. You then can figure out, well, how do I resolve this tension in my beliefs? How do I get rid of this contradiction? And in doing so, you can advance your own thinking and improve your own thinking. And I'll give you a nice example of creating aporia in the next video, but we'll stop this one there.